Stalin's failure, which taught Putin nothing,
The old man took for himself and acted with finality.
Yes, but Putin merit was that
The father of nations.
the same goal and the same expansionist ambitions, and the same outcome, a failure which is now forbidden to talk about. In the Russian Federation, they prefer not to remember this war, and they don't even call it a war. Instead, it's called a local conflict in which the USSR was simply helping. That's how Stalin presented it, and that's what Putin tried to do in Ukraine. But in the end, both of them lost on a global scale. 1.
on December 1st, 1939, in the border settlement of Terijoki, which had been occupied by the Red Army, the FDR, the Finnish Democratic Republic, was proclaimed.
We're talking about the Soviet-Finnish War. It began on November 30th, 1939, and lasted for 105 days.
Every nation truly becomes a nation when it has some kind of heroic deed of its own. And for the Finns, of course, that's the Soviet-Finnish War.
Why is this war considered Stalin's biggest failure? Stalin's. How is it similar to the war in Ukraine in 2014? And how did the Finns manage to hold back the onslaught of the Red Army? Arsenal is ready to tell you all about it. Make yourself comfortable, we're starting. The bone of contention between Finland and the USSR was Finnish territory. It was much too close to the empire's second capital, St. Petersburg. Stalin didn't like that. Doesn't that remind you of anyone? That's why, even before the start of World War II, everyone was aware of the threat from the USSR, despite the Soviet-Finnish non-aggression pact signed in 1932. Carl Gustaf Mannerheim, who headed Finland's Defense Council, was convinced of the threat and even insisted on building defensive fortifications. On the Karelian Isthmus, these fortifications later became known as the Mannerheim Line and proved to be a salvation for the Finns. But more on that a bit later. The Finnish leadership, for its part, was counting on help from other countries, particularly Germany. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact changed everything. In August 1939, the Soviet Union and Germany divided Eastern Europe between themselves. The Baltic countries and Finland found themselves in the so-called Soviet sphere of influence. No one expected any help from Germany anymore. Thanks to this document, the Soviet Union forced Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia to sign non-aggression pacts with the Union. The Kremlin stationed its military bases on their territories. Thus, the countries were de facto occupied by Stalin. They wanted to do the same with Finland, but Finland didn't fall for it. The Finns decided to maintain neutrality in the outbreak of the World War, and the presence of Soviet troops on their land did not fit with that at all. This was completely incompatible. Negotiations followed. The Kremlin tried to achieve its goals through diplomatic means.
It turned into a vicious circle. The Soviet side made proposals that were unacceptable to the Finns, and they rejected them, only to receive new offers in response, each even less acceptable than the last. On November 9th, 1939, the negotiations finally collapsed. By that time, the Soviet side was hinting that it would not stop short of war. So, on November 3rd, the newspaper Pravda published this kind of front-page article dedicated to the Finnish issue. We will throw out to hell all the games of political card sharps and go our own way, no matter what. We will ensure the security of the USSR, breaking through any obstacles on the way to our goal.
Everything changed. November 26, 1939. At that time, the Soviets claimed that the Finns had shelled their troops on the border with artillery. Of course, this was a lie. There was shelling, but it was a provocation by the Soviet Union. Already on November 30th, Soviet bombers dropped 600 bombs on Helsinki, and ground troops began the invasion.
According to the plan, 4 Soviet armies and nearly 500,000 people were to invade the country along the entire border, from the Karelian Isthmus to Lapland. It seemed that this would be more than enough to secure victory. The confidence in their victory was so high that Soviet soldiers were even warned not to accidentally cross the border into Sweden.
At the same time, the Soviets did not declare war. They intended to take a different approach. The same approach that in 2014 inspired Putin.
On December 1st, 1939, in the border settlement of Terijoki, occupied by the Red Army, the FDR, the Finnish Democratic Republic, was proclaimed. And already on December 2nd, its authorities signed a treaty of cooperation and mutual assistance with the Soviet Union. The government of this Finnish DNR was made up of Finnish communist émigrés who lived in the Soviet Union. All its official documents were edited by the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party, and in the so-called People's Army of the FDR, only regular commanders and soldiers of the Red Army served.
The Soviets expected the war to be lightning fast. They were planning a gift for the leader to occupy Finland in 3 weeks, by December 21st, Stalin's birthday. It would seem, what kind of resistance could the Finns put up in terms of armament? They had only 32 tanks and 2 armored cars. About 30 more tanks remained from the First World War, and for the most part, they were only good for being used as stationary firing points. At that time, the Red Army and its tanks were counted in the thousands. But the Finns did not surrender. The Mannerheim Line once again played a significant role. Later, the Soviets even created a myth about the invincibility of this line. This myth was cultivated by Soviet propaganda to explain the defeat of the Red Army. In reality, things were much more mundane. The Red Army was broken by the fighting spirit of the Finnish soldiers. For Stalin, it was a complete surprise that the entire nation rose to defend their homeland. At the same time, chaos reigned in the Red Army, and on top of that, the frost set in.
The telegrams testify to just how bad things were with supply and logistics in the Red Army. And that's just for a single signal battalion. I quote, "The situation is dire. The horses have been eaten and there were no airdrops, meaning no supplies delivered by plane. There are 600 sick, hunger, scurvy, death. We have been surrounded for 16 days, 500 wounded. There is no ammunition or food. The wounded are dying. We are finishing off the last horse. We can only hold out until tonight. Our own aircraft bombed us by mistake. Help us, save us, otherwise we will all perish." In
the middle of February 1940, Soviet troops finally managed to break through the Mannerheim Line and reach Viborg, the second most important Finnish city. Only then did the government ask for peace.
Nazi Germany played a behind-the-scenes role in this. On February 22, 1940, the second most powerful man in the Third Reich, Hermann Göring, advised the Finnish ambassador to persuade his government not to accept help from the Western powers and to make peace with Moscow. Even if it meant territorial losses, Göring directly hinted at the imminent German attack on the Soviet Union and that if the Finns took part, they would get everything back with interest.
Finland lost the territories captured by the Red Army, but retained its independence. At the same time, there was no victory here for Stalin. In 105 days of war, Soviet troops lost 126,000, killed alone. The Finns lost 5 times less, 25,000. Although for a country with a population of just over 3 million at the time, this was a serious loss.
On the day the peace was signed, flags were lowered, and newspapers in Finland came out with mourning borders. So this was seen as a defeat in that the Soviet Union achieved what it wanted, but every nation becomes a nation when it has some kind of heroic deed of its own. And for the Finns, of course, that is the Soviet-Finnish War.
What do you think of the Finns' resistance? And do you agree that this war was a huge failure for Stalin? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our Arsenal channel so you don't miss out on all the most interesting content.